In the world of American celebrity, few names carry the layered weight of Rob Reiner. Director, actor, producer, and political commentator, Reiner has long existed at the crossroads of art and ideology. For decades, he has been outspoken, unafraid to lend both his voice and his resources to causes he believes in. And like many public figures, his actions, financial, political, or personal, are often scrutinized most intensely when tragedy strikes. It was no different this time. Before the tragedy unfolded, before headlines hardened and social media narratives crystallized, Rob Reiner had done something he had done many times before. He donated money to democratic causes. At the time, it was routine, barely newsworthy. Another line item in the long ledger of celebrity political giving. But tragedy has a way of rearranging timelines. Suddenly, what once felt ordinary became suspicious to some, symbolic to others, and deeply misunderstood by many. A history of belief, not secrecy. Rob Reiner's political leanings have never been a mystery. He did not hide them behind studio gates or bury them in obscure filings. His beliefs were voiced openly, repeatedly, and sometimes loudly. To supporters, he was principled. To critics, provocative, but rarely was he described as covert. Long before the tragedy, Reiner spoke passionately about democracy, voting rights, and what he viewed as the moral responsibility of public figures. His donations aligned with those views. They were legal, disclosed, and consistent with a lifetime of civic engagement. Yet when the tragedy occurred, sudden, shocking, and emotionally charged, the public began to look backward. And when people look backward, they often look for meaning. The tragedy changes everything. Tragedy is a magnifying glass. It does not create facts, but it enlarges perceptions. In the aftermath, questions filled the air. Some were genuine, driven by grief and confusion. Others were fueled by distrust, shaped by political polarization, and amplified by online echo chambers. Why now? Why him? Why before the tragedy? The timing, to some, felt too coincidental. For others, it was irrelevant. But in the modern media landscape, coincidence rarely survives untouched. Social media threads began to circulate. Clips were reposted. Donation records, public but previously ignored, were reframed as evidence, stripped of context and reassembled into narratives that traveled faster than nuance ever could. Reiner, once again, found himself less a person than a symbol. When public records become public weapons, political donations are meant to be transparent. Ironically, that transparency can become a double-edged sword. What was designed to ensure accountability sometimes becomes a tool for suspicion. In Reiner's case, donations that predated the tragedy were retroactively assigned, meaning they never carried at the time. The reality was simple. The donations happened first. The tragedy came later. No secret meetings, no hidden agendas, just a timeline. But stories do not always follow timelines. They follow emotions. And grief, fear, and anger rarely ask for footnotes. The burden of being vocal. Rob Reiner is not new to criticism. His outspoken nature has earned him admiration and backlash in equal measure. Yet even for someone accustomed to controversy, the emotional gravity of tragedy shifts the ground beneath one's feet. When tragedy strikes, silence is interpreted as guilt by some, and speech is interpreted as manipulation by others. There is no perfect response, no safe tone. If Reiner spoke, critics accused him of deflection. If he remained quiet, they accused him of hiding. The paradox of modern public life is that intention matters less than interpretation. Art, politics, and the search for control. At its core, the controversy revealed something deeper about society than about Rob Reiner himself. People want control in moments of chaos. Tragedy strips that control away. Political narratives offer a way to reclaim it, to point, to explain, to blame. Reiner's donation became a symbol not because of what it caused, but because of what people needed it to represent. For some, it confirmed existing beliefs. For others, it became a convenient villain. For many, it was simply confusing. But confusion is uncomfortable, and the internet is not kind to discomfort. The human cost behind the headlines, lost in the noise, was the simplest truth. Tragedy hurts real people, families, friends, communities. Rob Reiner, regardless of one's opinion of him, is still human. A man who has lived long enough to know that grief does not respect political affiliation. It does not pause for ideological debates. It arrives uninvited and leaves scars that no public statement can erase. To reduce tragedy to political talking points is to misunderstand its nature. What the timeline really tells us, when stripped of speculation, the timeline tells a quiet story. A public figure donated to political causes he had supported for years. A tragedy occurred later, unrelated in cause but forever linked in public memory. The internet connected dots that were never meant to form a picture. This is not a story about conspiracy. It is a story about perception, about how quickly meaning is assigned after loss, about how fame turns ordinary actions into symbols. Reflection, not resolution. There may never be a resolution that satisfies everyone. In an era where outrage is currency and certainty is rare, stories like this linger. But perhaps the most honest takeaway is also the simplest. Political donations are not prophecies. Timing is not intent. And tragedy deserves compassion before conclusions. Rob Reiner gave money to Democrats before the tragedy, not as a secret act, not as a signal, but as a continuation of beliefs he had never hidden. Everything else came later, shaped not by facts alone, but by fear, emotion, and the stories people chose to tell. And in the end, those stories say as much about us as they do about him. Yet, even after the initial shock faded, the conversation did not. It lingered, resurfacing in comment sections, late-night talk shows, and opinion pieces that blurred the line between analysis and accusation. The tragedy had moved on in real time, but online it remained frozen, looped endlessly, reframed again and again through political lenses. For Rob Reiner, the days that followed were quieter, but heavier. Public life rarely allows space for private reckoning. Every appearance, every silence, every word was weighed. Some expected apologies that made no sense. Others demanded explanations for things that required none. It was the price of visibility in an age where outrage outpaces understanding. What few acknowledge was how predictable this pattern had become. Tragedy strikes. Facts lag behind emotion. Narratives rush in to fill the void, and familiar names, especially outspoken ones, become anchors for collective anxiety. Reiner's long history of political engagement made him an easy reference point, a recognizable face onto which abstract fears could be projected. But time, as it often does, began to dull the sharpest edges. New headlines emerged. Attention shifted. The story lost its urgency, though not its lessons. Those who had looked closely realized there was no hidden thread tying belief to disaster. What remained was a cautionary tale about how quickly intention can be rewritten after the fact. In quieter moments, the episode stood as a reminder. Democracy is messy, public discourse even more so. Transparency does not guarantee understanding, and visibility does not equal control. For all the speculation, the truth remained unchanged. One action did not cause another. The tragedy stood alone, tragic in its own right, untouched by political bookkeeping. And perhaps that is where the story truly rests, not in the donations, not in the outrage, but in the unresolved tension between grief and meaning. A reminder that not every event fits into a narrative, and not every narrative deserves to survive the truth. Over time, that unresolved tension began to reveal something quieter but more enduring: fatigue. Not just for Rob Reiner, but for a public increasingly worn down by cycles of outrage that promised revelation and delivered very little. Each repetition of the story lost some of its heat until what remained was not anger, but a kind of hollow curiosity, an echo asking why this had ever felt so urgent in the first place. In private conversations among people less interested in spectacle, the framing slowly shifted. The question was no longer what did this mean, but why did we need it to mean something at all? That question lingered uncomfortably because it pointed away from individuals and toward a collective habit, the reflex to politicize grief in order to make it manageable. Rob Reiner's life, like most long public lives, had been built in chapters, some creative, some political, some deeply personal. The tragedy did not neatly belong to any of them. It resisted categorization, and yet, in trying to understand it, many had forced it into the chapter they knew best: politics. Donations became shorthand. Ideology became explanation. Complexity was flattened into alignment. That flattening was the real loss. Because once events are reduced to symbols, empathy thins. The human dimension fades behind talking points. The people most affected by the tragedy, those who live with its consequences daily, were pushed to the margins while louder voices argued over relevance and blame. Reiner himself seemed to understand this better than most. In later moments, when he did speak publicly, his words were measured, stripped of performance. He did not attempt to reclaim narrative control. Instead, he emphasized something unfashionable: restraint. He spoke about grief without attaching it to ideology, about responsibility without accusation, about the danger of certainty in moments that demand humility. It was not the response many wanted, but it may have been the only honest one. As weeks turned into months, the story settled into archives and algorithms, resurfacing only occasionally, usually stripped of context, usually revived by someone encountering it for the first time. Each revival carried less force, like a copy of a copy, until the edges blurred and the original emotion was barely recognizable. What endured was not proof or scandal, but a lesson quietly absorbed by those paying attention. Transparency does not prevent misinterpretation, and good faith is fragile in polarized times. Even actions taken openly, consistently, and legally can be reframed when fear is searching for structure. In the end, the tragedy did not redefine Rob Reiner's beliefs, nor did his beliefs redefine the tragedy. They existed on parallel tracks, briefly intersecting in public perception before drifting apart again. What connected them was not causality, but timing, and timing, as history repeatedly shows, is a poor substitute for truth. The story closes not with answers, but with a pause, a space where reflection might replace reaction, where the next tragedy, because there will always be another, might be met first with compassion, not conclusions. And if that lesson lingers longer than the controversy ever did, then perhaps something meaningful was salvaged from the noise after all. That pause, fragile and easily broken, invited a deeper reckoning, one that extended beyond Rob Reiner and into the machinery of modern attention itself. In the quiet after the noise, it became harder to ignore how quickly society had demanded coherence from chaos, how urgently it had searched for a storyline sturdy enough to lean on. Tragedy, after all, is intolerable when it refuses to explain itself. What lingered was a subtle discomfort. If this story had been built on inference rather than fact, how many others were too? How many moments of grief had been conscripted into ideological battles simply because they occurred near familiar names or well-worn divisions? These questions did not trend. They did not spark debates or generate clicks, but they persisted privately in the minds of those who had watched the cycle unfold one time too many. For Reiner, the episode faded into the background of a long life lived under observation. He returned to work, to conversations about film and culture, to the steady rhythm of advocacy that had always defined him. There was no grand closing statement, no attempt to reclaim a final word. In some ways, that absence spoke louder than any defense. It suggested an understanding that not every misunderstanding can be corrected, and not every narrative is worth chasing. Meanwhile, the public moved on, as it always does. New controversies replaced old ones. Fresh tragedies demanded attention. Yet traces remained, embedded in the collective memory as a cautionary outline rather than a detailed account, a reminder of how easily timelines can be rearranged, how swiftly intention can be overwritten by implication. In retrospect, the story became less about what happened and more about how it was processed. It exposed the vulnerability of truth in an era that values immediacy over reflection. It showed how transparency, once considered a safeguard, can be repurposed when context is discarded. And it underscored a simple, uneasy reality: meaning is often imposed, not discovered. As the years press forward, the episode will likely blur further, reduced to a footnote or a half-remembered argument, but its shadow remains useful. It urges restraint, it asks for patience, it challenges the instinct to turn every coincidence into a conclusion. And perhaps that is the quiet end of the story, not with resolution, but with awareness, an acknowledgement that tragedy does not need interpretation to be real, and that sometimes the most responsible response is to let events be what they are, without forcing them to serve a narrative they were never meant to carry. That awareness, once it takes root, has a way of changing how future stories are received. For some observers, the episode became a private checkpoint, a moment remembered whenever a new controversy began to form. They recognized the familiar ingredients: the well-known figure, a charged event, a timeline sliced into suggestive fragments. And with that recognition came hesitation, a second look, sometimes even restraint. It didn't mean cynicism replaced concern. If anything, it sharpened it. Concern redirected itself away from speculation and toward consequence, toward the people actually living with loss, toward systems that failed quietly long before headlines noticed, toward the slow work of prevention rather than the instant gratification of blame. These shifts were subtle and uneven, but they mattered. In cultural circles, conversations grew more nuanced. Filmmakers, writers, and commentators, people accustomed to shaping narratives, began acknowledging how easily narrative tools could mislead when applied to real suffering. A story arc that works in cinema can distort reality. A cause and effect sequence that satisfies an audience can erase complexity. The tragedy, reframed through this lens, became a reminder of the ethical weight that comes with storytelling itself. Rob Reiner's name, once central to the swirl, receded into its proper proportion. Not erase, not absolve, simply contextualize. A participant in public life, not the axis upon which unrelated events turned. His donations returned to what they had always been: expressions of belief in a system that allows disagreement, participation, and transparency, imperfect as it may be. And yet, the internet never fully forgets. From time to time, the story resurfaced in fragments. A headline here, a clipped sentence there, often detached from the reflective arc that followed. Each fragment tested the audience anew. Would it reignite old assumptions, or would it pass quietly, recognized for what it was, an incomplete echo? In those moments, the true measure of the episode revealed itself, not in whether consensus was reached, but in whether reflex gave way to reflection, whether grief was met with care rather than capture, whether the space between events was allowed to exist without being forcibly bridged. That space, once acknowledged, proved essential. It held uncertainty without fear. It allowed empathy to breathe. It accepted that not every question demands an answer, and not every action requires retroactive meaning. So the story continues, not as a scandal with a conclusion, but as a living example, one that reappears whenever timing tempts interpretation, whenever belief is mistaken for causation, whenever tragedy is asked to carry more than it can bear. And in that continuation lies its quiet power, a reminder that understanding is not always found in connecting dots, but sometimes in resisting the urge to draw lines at all. That resistance to draw lines where none truly exists slowly became the most valuable inheritance of the episode. It was not universal, nor was it loud, but it settled into the background of public consciousness like a low, steady hum, a reminder that meaning does not have to be immediate to be real, and that patience can be an ethical choice. For some, the story prompted a reassessment of how they consumed information altogether. Headlines were no longer taken as endpoints, but as beginnings. Dates were checked. Context was questioned. The seductive pull of implication lost some of its power when people recognized how often it had misled them before. This shift did not dismantle polarization, but it softened its edges, if only briefly. In academic and journalistic spaces, the tragedy was occasionally referenced as an example, not of scandal, but of narrative drift. How stories migrate once released, how intention dissolves as repetition takes over, how a factual statement can mutate through emphasis alone, gaining weight without gaining truth. These discussions were rarely about Rob Reiner specifically. His name had become incidental, a placeholder for a broader phenomenon. And that, perhaps, was the final transformation of the story. What began as a focus on one man's actions evolved into a meditation on collective behavior. The spotlight moved outward, illuminating the systems that reward speed over care, reaction over reflection. In that light, the earlier outrage felt less like a moral reckoning and more like a stress response. Society bracing itself against uncertainty by reaching for familiar shapes. Reiner himself continued forward, carrying the episode as one carries many things in a long life. Not erased, not dominant, simply folded into experience. He remained vocal, but with an added gravity that comes from having seen how easily words can be repurposed. His later comments, where they touched on tragedy at all, emphasized listening over speaking, solidarity over statement. As time stretched on, the tragedy found its rightful place, not as a hinge upon which unrelated actions swung, but as a singular event with its own weight, its own sorrow. The noise that once surrounded it faded, leaving behind a quieter, more honest reckoning, one that acknowledged loss without exploiting it, and belief without distorting it. In the end, the story never resolved because it was never meant to. It did not offer a lesson neatly wrapped or a moral clearly labeled. Instead, it offered something less satisfying but more enduring, a mirror, one that reflected how easily certainty can be manufactured, how readily grief can be recruited, and how necessary it is, again and again, to pause. And in that pause, the story continues to breathe, not as accusation or defense, but as a reminder that truth is often found not in the connections we insist upon, but in the restraint we choose when meaning feels just out of reach.